Good evening, everyone. It feels like afternoon. It's so nice and sunny and bright out there. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the FIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fund lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Justin Sledge with us to present part one of Tree of Life, the connection between the divine and the world. Next Thursday, part two, Dr. Sledge will return to finish out the talk. And you'll quickly see, if you haven't had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Sledge, he packs so much information into his lectures that you just feel like you're getting a mini college course tonight. So it's great. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. I would like to remind you that after Dr. Sledge's lecture, and the next Sheppy Dog Fun lecture will be Thursday, July 20th, with Dr. Taylor Haygood, who will present on carnival and circus lithography from 1880 to 1940. Before I bring tonight's guest, Dr. Sledge, to the stage, I'd also like to remind you that every Thursday we're open to 8 p.m. That includes our cafe and shop. So if you feel like having a glass of wine or a little bite to eat right after the lecture, it's open until 8 p.m. Every Thursday, especially during the summer, we're doing different programming, so check out our website if you're interested in coming back for different things. We'd like to take the opportunity to thank the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry every day of the week for Genesee County citizens. Thank you. I would also like to thank the Ford Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible. Yes, thank you. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Dr. Justin Sledge was born in Jackson, Mississippi. He received a master's in mysticism and esoteric philosophy from the University of Amsterdam, and a master's and PhD in philosophy from the University of Memphis. So he does know the meaning of life, I think. At least he knows the right questions to ask. He's written on the intersection of metaphysics and politics, often focusing on non-canon figures in the Western intellectual tradition. Dr. Sledge currently teaches philosophy and religious studies at Wayne State University. Everyone, please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Justin Sledge.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out, and I'd like to extend a thanks to the staff here at the FIA. What a beautiful institution you guys have here. So thank you, Tracy, and everyone who's helping to make this lecture possible. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a bit of an unusual topic, and on the one hand, it's unusual, but on the other hand, it might be one of the most important questions we can ask as human beings. And that's to say, what is the bridge between us and the world of the divine? Now, you might not believe in the world of the divine, you might be an atheist or perhaps an agnostic, but you still might be interested in the idea that many people have asked this question, and that the way that they answered it, whether you are an atheist or an agnostic, probably would have an impact on how you lived and whether or not perhaps you got burned at some point in history. So, the way that, again, these things matter whether you believe in them or not. So, what we're looking at here on this first slide is an interesting bridge between two very, very different worlds. On the left, you see the image of the hands. This is from the Cave of the Hands. This is a Paleolithic art, probably done, perhaps, we don't know, by a shaman in the Stone Age, actually found in what is called the Cave of the Hands in South America. And here we have a description or an image showing a rabbi holding what is called the Tree of Life. And the tree of life is a bridge. You see there at the very bottom. Let's see if I can turn on my laser gun. There we are. So at the very bottom, there you are on the map. This is the very bottom of the tree of life. And the idea in the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, is that you can climb this tree all the way to the top, and you can imagine who lives up there. Yes, that guy. And you can see if you read some Latin, it says, the gates of light, portae lucis, the gates of light. So that's what we're going to be looking at, right? What is this bridge between these worlds? So let me ask you a question. If you want to see more about what that looks like, that's from the Cave of the Hands in South America. They call it the Cave of the Hands for a reason. This image is, and if you're curious how they would accomplish this, we think that they would put their hand against the cave wall, then take a tube with ochre, which is a red pigment, and then blow that to make an outline of their hand, or they would paint the outline and then paint with the ochre. We also know, as we'll see in a minute, that the Paleolithic peoples would also coat the bones of the dead in ochre. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So this is the question, or a question at least. By show of hands, right? And I'm going to put this in a very broadly construed way. How many folks here think there's a world beyond this world? That this world is at some level not just one planet, but our entire dimension. The whole solar system, the whole cosmos, the whole everything, our universe, is just one side of a coin, and that there's some other side to that coin. Yeah, and I'm happy with maybe hands. Maybe hands. Hey, look, my maybes, I love maybes, because that's my philosophers in the room, like, I'm trying to commit to nothing. You just talk about burning people alive in a minute. I'm not committing to anything. I see you. I think that for all the folks that raised their hands, and that was certainly the vast majority, you're not alone in answering the question the way that you do. Even in our secular, sort of post-religious age, I think that this answer, right, whether you answered that question because you think there's a God there, or the ancestors, or spirits, or another dimension, or whatever reason you gave for that answer, I think you're in the vast community of people, all through history and all through time, who've shared a similar commitment. Now that leaves us with one more question. And that other question that it leaves us with is as if this world is just one part of a much vaster reality, how do you get there? How do you get there? How do you bridge that gap? And what we're going to talk about tonight and Thursday night next week is a history of the way that human beings, at least in the Western world, have built that bridge. And you best believe they've built a lot of different kinds of bridges. So we're going to explore some of those bridges, especially some bridges that maybe you haven't heard of. So, as I just mentioned, right, there's a very nearly universally felt sense, right, intuition. How many people here, just by show of hands, if you're willing to be really brave, how many folks have experienced that other world? Or think you have. Either way, again, this is a judgment-free zone. We're talking about weird stuff. Get comfortable with weird stuff. And again, no judgment, psychedelic drugs, mysticism, breathing, yoga, handling snakes in Virginia. You are all in good company here. Trust me, I come from Mississippi. We get up to weird things down there. So what I'm arguing here for is that this is at some level relatively common in the human experience. And the idea is that there is another world, some other world that is different than ours. And how many people would say, just again, by show of hands, if you're willing to be brave, how many people think that that other world, whatever that is, means to you, that that other world is somehow more real than this one? That this one is just transient. It's passing away. It won't be here forever, but that other world will be. Right? The sweet by and by, whatever you want to think of it. Heaven, we're not going to put a lot of names on it, but that idea that somehow it is more real and more fundamentally true than this world is a deeply held belief from religious people to philosophers to mystics to psychedelic drug users. It is a wide swath of human experience. In that other realm, it tends to be populated by beings, gods, the spirits, ancestors, angels, demons, all kinds of beings are said to populate that world. We'll talk about maybe some of those beings next time. But the various idea is that many cultures have developed the idea that we're living in kind of two worlds, and at some level we can access that other world. What you're seeing on the screen here is what is called the Flammarion engraving. We don't know who did it. It was done in the 19th century. It's rather evocative, but what you can see is that this is our world. Here's our sun, here are the stars, here's the moon, and notice what he's doing. He's poked his head through. And on here, right, there's all kinds of cool psychedelics things going on over here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but here there is a weird, like, wheel within a wheel. Looks like a bunch of wheels within wheels. If you're a fan of the book of Ezekiel, you may remember in the book of Ezekiel, that is one of the things that Ezekiel sees that supports the throne of God, that God's throne, we'll see an image of this later, is supported on wheels. And what he's seeing right here at the very edges of his perception is the very throne of God. So he's poked his head through. I don't recommend that. That sounds very dangerous. But he's poked his head through the veil of reality, through the veil of the stars themselves. And you can see it's quite an experience. He's kind of like, so he is seeing the beyond. So your mileage may vary with the beyond, that is. What's our earliest evidence in the world for this other world? What you're looking at is the pelvis of a young boy buried about 34,000 years ago in what is now Russia. This boy was probably about 13 or 14. So what we see here is his pelvis. There's something fascinating about looking at the body of a 34,000-year-old human body. But what's even more impressive about this body is what was buried with it. Remember that red that you saw on the hands? That was in South America. This is in Russia. Notice that he was covered with beads, laid basically here in his lap, right? And as he decomposed, the beads fell and they stuck. They're covered in ochre, the same exact ochre there. Now, these are beads, right? They're laying in his lap and they're unstrung. We didn't find the remnants of a string. The beads were just laid there in his lap. We don't know why. These are Stone Age people. They didn't tell us why. We can only guess. But typically speaking, you don't bury something with someone if they're not going somewhere. It seems like a completely reasonable belief. Again, we don't know, and we have to be very curious and be honest about what we don't know. But it seems quite possible, maybe even reasonable, maybe even likely, that this is the first evidence, the first kind of evidence we have, that when they put this young boy in his grave 34,000 years ago, that at some level, they didn't think he was completely dead. He was going somewhere. Where? We don't know. We'll never know. These people are long lost to us. But at some level, 34,000 years ago, perhaps this is the first instance, the first evidence we have of this practice. By the way, we see these kinds of burials with ochre and what are called grave goods. We see this with every human culture through the Stone Age, and we've just discovered what we think is evidence of it with Neanderthals. Neanderthals, they didn't have grave goods like this. They don't seem to have developed them. But what we do find is pollen on the body, and the pollen on the body is in such enormous amounts that it seems like before they were inhumed or they were buried, that large amounts of flowers were put down on top of the body. So again, we don't know exactly why the Neanderthals did this, but they're like us enough that perhaps the same kind of things were going on in their head. And we also know, of course, that we mated with Neanderthals. If you're from Western Europe, you have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, probably. Anyone here done a 23andMe? And did anyone here get Neanderthal DNA? Yeah? Yeah, if you're from Western Europe, you're going to get between 1% and 4%. That means that, and by the way, it's all mitochondrial DNA, which means that it seems like Neanderthal men could mate with human women, but we don't see any genetic evidence of the other. What that means, I don't know, but maybe Neanderthal girls weren't easy. Sorry. The earliest accounts that we have in culture of someone able to bridge the gap between this world and the other world is a ritual expert that we now refer to as a shaman. Now, in anthropology these days and in religious studies, we have a little light touch when this word comes to shaman. This is a very particular kind of ritual expert. They actually come from what we now know as Siberia, the area around Tunguska, the Tunguska event, if you've ever heard of that. In the early 20th century, anthropologists were able to locate some of these people. You're looking at a female shaman. We almost always think of shamans as being male, but there were lots of female shamans in the history of the world. This is an example of one from the early 20th century in the Tunguska region. And this shaman, the shaman, generally speaking, as much as this category is problematic, we still use it in religious studies and in anthropology. But what they do is that they're able to achieve what we might call an alteration of consciousness. Now, we don't like to talk about altered states of consciousness because almost every state is an altered state of consciousness. That's just what consciousness is. If you go out tonight and have a glass of wine, altered state of consciousness. I'm pretty sure how many people got caffeinated this morning. You went from one state of consciousness to another one. Alterations in consciousness just are what consciousness is. But what we would talk about is a significant alteration in consciousness, and they achieve this through a wide range of means. This would include things like psychoactive substances, so things we would now call psychedelics, or entheogens. Entheogens literally means to bring God within the body. Music, song, dance. Here we have, again, a shaman or shamaness using a drum. This would also get you into alterations of consciousness. Special breathing techniques would also be used, and all of these can combine in various kinds of ways through various kinds of cultures. And these techniques would allow you, or allow the shaman, I don't know if you're a shaman, I'm not one, but this would allow you to enter into an alternate world. The spirit world, the world of the ancestors. There's lots of different names for this depending on the culture that you go to, heaven. And this might be done for a wide range of reasons. Healing is a very common reason why shamans travel to this other world. These journeys are often very perilous, by the way. The shaman doesn't like to do this. This is not like a Tuesday thing. This is the spirit world can be very perilous. It's not like our world. It's very different, and they're not exactly welcome there in some cases. So for healing, you might try to get knowledge of the future. In fact, in many ritual cultures in which hunting and gathering is a big part of their culture, killing animals is taken very seriously. We don't take that very seriously now. I don't know what animal died for my boots. Well, unfortunately, we don't treat animals with the same respect that many hunter-gatherers. And so often they would have to go to the spirit world to actually contact the animal spirits to get permission to hunt them. So this was a big part of what went on in the shamanic world. And often they would pass down their ritual knowledge through initiation. So this was not a thing that you could just do. It wasn't like you applied on LinkedIn and you got a job as a shaman. Typically you had to train someone, initiate someone into the process. Shamanism, by the way, is making a huge comeback in world religions. What is developing now is what is called transcultural shamanism, where we have various techniques from various cultures being used by various peoples to achieve these spirit voyages in lots of different contexts. So we have, for instance, white people going down to Central and South America to learn from indigenous people their shamanic practices, and those are being brought back to this country and do a great deal of healing. I'll give you one example of this. Shamanic healing using ayahuasca, which is a psychoactive drug, is actually showing one of the most promising signs of actually stopping very severe cases of alcoholism. So this is a case where something like severe alcoholism is actually being shown very prominently to be cured by these kinds of shamanic journeys. And if you doubt that, you can go ask Johns Hopkins. They're the ones doing the research. So you go medical-splain Johns Hopkins. But this is things that are being incorporated into Western medicine, and it is having great success with all kinds of things. Also post-traumatic stress disorder, which many veterans suffer from enormously. These kinds of medicines are proving to be effective when other kinds of medicines are not. So again, this is a case where very ancient technologies, primitive technologies, are showing up to be incredibly important in very contemporary life. Our next big case of evidence for this journey to this other world is a place called Göbekli Tepe, which I believe Dr. Klein has gone to, much to my jealousy. So if you're watching this, Dr. Klein, take me to Göbekli Tepe. How many folks have heard of Göbekli Tepe? A couple folks. It's getting a little bit more press these days. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Turkey. It means the Potbelly Hill, which is a great name. We should just keep the Potbelly Hill. It's a complex of enclosed megalithic structures that were built around 95 to 9000 BCE. Just to give you a rough reference for that, our earliest cities in Mesopotamia are about 5000 BCE. So if you want a rough sense of this, the pyramids were built about 3500 BCE. This is significantly older. So this is a series of megalithic structures. They're large T-shaped structures. They were arranged in circles and probably covered. We don't know that for sure, but they were probably covered. You're looking at the site here. Only 4% of it's been excavated, FYI. We don't know what's in there, actually. This is a huge, massively important, this shouldn't exist. This should not exist by all rights. This is a basically Neolithic site. So what we do know, or what we postulate about this site, is that it was built to be a kind of gate or to simulate an experience of going into the underworld. That's what the main archaeologists who've excavated it thinks. And there are many images of animals and human beings, often decapitated human beings with erect phalluses. Often the animals are shown in very aggressive postures on the site, and we think that maybe they went into this area in order to go into it, probably maybe a sort of shamanic technique of entering into a kind of underworld. Again, we don't know at all why they built this. What's even stranger is that about 9000 BCE, they buried it. Now imagine the effort to go through building something like this with stone tools. Now imagine the effort to go through and burying it. That's why it's in such great shape. You can see the stone pillars are still standing. It's incredible. So we don't know exactly what this site is of Göbekli Tepe. What we do know, at least roughly, is that they seem to have been connected to a similar culture at what is probably our first city in human history, a place called Chateau Hoya. Now, I know most of us know Mesopotamia, we know Sumeria. Those are the first continuous civilizations. Those civilizations lasted, and they wrote, so we know a lot about them through their writing. At Chateau Hoya, it failed. It failed for complex reasons, including monoagriculture and other kinds of reasons. But what we do know about Chateau Hoya is that they seem to have buried their dead in the floor, with the exception of their heads. Their heads, they plastered. They placed seashells in their eyes, you're looking at one, and they put them into the walls of their houses along with the heads of other animals. We don't know, again, but what we think is that these are their ancestors. They lived with their ancestors. Many cultures do this, by the way. Many cultures bury their dead beneath their homes. Aristocrats still do that. And you would bury your dead beneath your home, and you would take the skull or a death mask and often put it in the entryway to your home. Roman homes often have this as well. Death masks, not skulls, but, it'll do in a pinch. But what you're looking at here is very likely one of the ancestors connected to the Göbekli Tepe culture. We find these at Chateau Hoya, and we also find them at Jericho, which is our oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Dozens of these have been recovered, more than dozens, hundreds of these skulls have been recovered. You don't go through the effort of defleshing someone you care about and then reconstituting their head, often again with seashells for eyes, if you're not opening their eyes up so they can see again. And maybe they're helping you. But again, we don't know. But you don't go through this much effort if you think death is the end. Right? It seems reasonable. Reasonable. I can't tell you that's what it is. But what's reasonable? It seems reasonable. The first people that we know to write were, of course, the ancient Sumerians, as I'm sure all of you know. And among the ancient Sumerians is the first time we have a glimpse of what it means to try to become one of the beings that might live in that other world. Most people don't like the idea of dying. Dying fills most people with existential dread, right? You ever had that moment where you're like, I don't know, in the shower washing your beard as you do, and you think to yourself, one day I'm not going to exist anymore. And you kind of like shake it off and go do something else. That moment of existential dread, I think most of us face at some point in our life. Some of us face it all the time. We take medicine for it. And the idea is that here, we have one of the first people in human history try to say, you know what, I'm not going to just worry about it, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to become one of the gods, because the gods don't die. So what am I going to do? I'm going to become eternal. I don't want to die. And our first person to attempt this was the king Gilgamesh. I imagine most folks in here have read the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's one of the great, just FYI, if you've only read it in the past 5 or 10 years, you should reread it, because we found some more of it. Yes, more of it. Do you remember the scene where Gilgamesh and his buddy, Enkidu, which is the best name ever, Enkidu are going to the cedar forest to fight Humbaba, the big demon? If you've never read an edition from just like 10 years ago, they just sort of teleport to Lebanon. There's a long way to go between Iraq and Lebanon, right? That's a schlep, right? We found a new tablet, and the new tablet describes the journey. And so what we get is all kinds of stuff about them entering into the cedar forest. So if you've only read it in the past like 10 years, reread it, because there's more of it. So again, you never know what's going to pop out of the ground. At any rate, our first mention of something like another world is from a text called the Instructions of Shuropak, another amazing name. The Sumerians had a knack for names. How many folks have heard of the Instructions of Shuropak? Most people have never heard of this text. The Instructions of Shuropak and the Hymn to the Temple Kesh are the oldest 2 literary documents in the world. If you get the chance to go read them, because they are the oldest pieces of literature recovered by human beings. The Kesh hymn, K-E-S-H, and the Instructions of Shuropak. You can read both of them online in reliable translations for free. But in the Instructions of Shuropak was a king like Gilgamesh, and he collected a bunch of wisdom, and that wisdom is in the instructions. It's like the book of Proverbs in the Bible, if you're familiar with that. I don't recommend following most of the instructions here. Some of them are pretty terrible. It's how to be a good king. You can imagine being a good king at this time doesn't make you a good person, and you'd be right. But he tells us in the instructions, heaven is far away and earth is most precious, but it is with heaven that you multiply your goods, and all foreign lands breathe beneath it. This is the first time in human history where we have a sense that there's something above you that's more eternal than you are, but down here matters too, but you really only have success down here if you get right by what's up there, right? And in fact, even the term heaven, which in Sumerian is An, because, I got to flex my Sumerian muscles. The term is An, and the little symbol that goes after An is what is called the Dingir symbol, and it looks like a star. So literally, their word for heaven is just the symbol for star. It looks like a star. So this is the first time in literature, in writing, where we know they believe in this. By the way, it wasn't like this text was the first thing human beings ever thought. It's just the earliest thing we have in their writing. So this idea probably existed significantly earlier than the text that we have. Although, as I mentioned, Gilgamesh, which, by the way, his name was just as likely Bilgamesh, which somehow sets just wonderfully for me. I call him Bill for short. But Gilgamesh, or Bilgamesh, we actually don't know exactly how his name was pronounced. You can try both if you meet him. He wanted to achieve immortality. He was a king of ancient Sumeria, and he wanted to achieve immortality after he watched, he had an existential crisis. It's the first one in literature. And then he watched his good friend Enkidu die, and he was like, I don't like that. So how do I live forever? Well, he knew that there was one human being who had achieved it. Just one. And that human being that achieved immortality was a dude named Utnapishtim. Again, the Sumerian names. Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, as you may know from the Epic of Gilgamesh, was warned by one of the gods that human beings are making too much noise, and the gods decided to do what? Flood the earth. And the god Enlil told Utnapishtim, hey, they're going to flood the earth. You need to build a boat and save your family, and put some animals in there while you're at it. And sure enough, he did, and Utnapishtim's story becomes the Noah story. Right? It's a shared myth, flood myth found in all of ancient Mesopotamia. But unlike in the Noah story, Noah, if you've read that rest of that story in Noah, again, my little kids are now learning about Noah's Ark and stuff, and it's always the fun part about the animals going in and not about all the people drowning. It's also not about what happens to Noah after that. No one likes that part. Noah has a pretty bad go of it in the end. Utnapishtim doesn't. Not only does he survive the flood, he's given eternal life. So Gilgamesh goes on an epic journey to go meet Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim says, look, I'll give you the magical root that allows you to live forever. You just got to stay up for 7 days and 7 nights. And he doesn't. And so he can't have the root, and eventually he's condemned to mortality. I love the idea that he couldn't even beat sleep. If you can't beat sleep, do you deserve to beat death? The Sumerians had a way with humor. I appreciate their humor. At any rate, Gilgamesh would be told he would go back to his kingship, where he lived there at Ur, and he looked upon the vast splendor of the city he'd built, and he says, as long as people remember me, that's good enough. And up until around 90 of the Common Era, 90 AD, everyone knew who Gilgamesh was. He even shows up in the Book of Enoch. And then we forgot about him, and then we discovered him again in the 19th century, and good job, Gilgamesh. You kind of got forever. Another famous story from the same time period, right? And that's us trying to go into the world of eternity. Well, the gods also wanted to conquer death. Many of the gods did. They also wanted to sort of flex on death. And the most famous example of this is the first example we have of someone trying to enter into another world they're not supposed to be in, the underworld. And the most famous case of this was Inanna. Inanna, you may know her better as Ishtar. You may know her even better as Esther. That's where the name Esther comes from. Ishtar is the Akkadian. Inanna is the Sumerian word for her. Well, Inanna was sister to the queen of the underworld, a young lady named Ereshkigal. Again, you could name your daughter Ereshkigal. You could do that. I can't do that because my wife would kill me, but I would like to name my kid Ereshkigal and Humbaba. Just all Sumerian kids. It would be great. Utnapishtim. At any rate, Inanna, as you may know, is both a god of beauty, but it tends to be the case that in many of these cultures, gods of beauty are also gods of war. I don't know why it explains that, but they tend to go hand in hand, beauty and war. And Inanna decides she's bored. It's like Wednesday. She doesn't have anything to do. So what's she going to do? She's going to invade the underworld herself. So she packs her bags. She puts on her best garments, by the way. She's not going to go down there looking like a, schlub. She goes to go down there and really show bedecked, and she's going to go down there, basically whoop her sister, Ereshkigal, and take over the underworld. So she goes down into the underworld, what the Sumerians called Kur, which literally is the Sumerian word for mountain. They kind of imagine it as an inverse mountain going down into the earth, a bit like Dante's hell, if you can picture that. So she goes down, and as she enters into the underworld, the guardians of the underworld say, you can't bring any of that stuff in here. Everybody's equal in the underworld. And so what do? Every time she descends lower and lower into the underworld, they strip her of all her finery. Until eventually, she does meet her sister, and her sister says, what are you doing down here? No, you're dead now. You can't leave. And so what do? The natural thing you do when your sister visits you. You cut off her flesh and hang it on a hook. So she's, that's what your sister would do. So she hangs Inanna's flesh on the hook, and it's only through people praying for her. Once you do the thing in movies, right? Where if I'm not back in 2 hours, call the cops. Inanna said, hey, if I'm not back in 3 days, pray and give me offerings. And she was able to basically get up enough strength through people giving her offerings to get her skin back on, which is kind of Clive Barton feeling. It's a Hellraiser feel a little bit. So she gets her skin back on, and she manages to get out of the underworld, Kur. But Ereshkigal tells her there's a price. You've come down here, you've tasted death. I'll let you leave, but you have to bring a hostage to take your place. You got to trade. So she exits the underworld. The first person she sees is one of her servants. Her servants has been pouring out beer for her. Beer was a big part of Sumerian life. They drink it with straws. Next time you have a beer, drink it with a straw, Sumerian style. The Egyptians did that too. But at any rate, her first servant was pouring out wine for her, beer. Next servant, same thing. And then she comes upon her good-for-nothing husband. Guess what he's been doing for the past 3 days? Getting decked out in his best clothes and getting trashed. She went on a bender while she was gone, didn't offer her any sacrifices, guess what Inanna does to her beloved husband? Kicks him to the curb into the underworld. There are great images of Dumuzid being dragged to the underworld by what are called Gala demons. And they drag him to the underworld. Now he has to live in the underworld forever with the Gala demons. If your wife disappears for 3 days, pour out a little beer, don't go on a bender. You might end up in the Sumerian underworld. But again, the first example of the descent of Ishtar. Again, another text you can read online. They're very reliable translations. Have folks here ever read the descent of Ishtar? It's a wonderful text if you did get the chance to read it. You can read it online in good translation. But it is the first time we have an instance where someone's traveling between worlds, the realm of the gods, into the realm of the underworld. Also, she may have introduced us to the first zombies in history. When she gets to the gates of the underworld, she threatens the gatekeepers, because she's not dead, she's a god. She's the opposite of not dead. She can't die. And so she threatens the gatekeepers to open up the doors, and she famously says, "Gatekeeper, open your gate, that I may enter. If you do not open the gate to let me enter, I'll break the door down, I will wrench the lock. I'll smash the doorpost." God of war, right? I wasn't kidding, right? Look at this one. "I shall force the doors. I shall bring up the dead to consume the living. I shall make the dead outnumber the living." So, me zombie movie fans, it's her fault. There's a whole movie that just to be just this premise that she goes down and releases all the dead and they come back and eat the living. So I do love the idea here. We have our first zombies, first appearance. If you've ever seen images of ancient Egypt, moving a little bit there to the west, the image I'm sure you will conjure in your mind of ancient Egypt is the pyramids, the Giza Plateau, or perhaps the Valley of the Kings, or one of the many pyramids like the Saqqara Pyramid or the Bent Pyramid. One of the most pernicious misconceptions about those structures is they are tombs. They are not tombs. They were precisely the opposite of tombs. When you go in one of those, the entire point of those machines was to make you immortal. The pyramids were immortality machines. Never ever call them a tomb again, because the people that were put into them were not dead. They were just on their way to immortality. Now, they might look different than they did before they died, but the Egyptians would tell you, so do babies look different when they're little. When you're first born, you look real different than you do now. Right? So you look quite different when you go to the other side too. It's just a change. You're changing now. Pharaoh changed too. So never look at those tombs as tombs. They are machines for immortality. So how did they achieve immortality? Well, first at least it was just for the pharaohs, because they were kind of living gods already. So them transitioning to the world of eternity was kind of like that was an easy thing. He was kind of already halfway there, being a god. But one of the things you'll notice about the pyramids on the inside is they're absolutely bedecked in hieroglyphs. And those hieroglyphs on the inside, like the hieroglyphs of Unas, these are just long instances of what is called Heka. Now, Heka is not heck, like heck yeah. Heka is what we might translate as the Egyptian word for magic. Although I don't like that translation because magic conjures all kinds of magic conjures all kinds of associations that might all be positive. For the ancient Egyptians, Heka was just a force of nature like gravity, and just like in the same way that we can manipulate gravity to get things we want, you can manipulate Heka to get things that you want. So it was just a force of nature, and you could manipulate it. So it wasn't negative, and no one got burned for doing Heka. In fact, the expectation was you wanted someone to do Heka for you because that's how you became immortal. All of these hieroglyphs are spells to guide the soul of the pharaoh into the afterlife. They're techniques. Here's how you open your eyes. Here's how you open your nose. Here's how you move your arms. Here's the parts of the journey that you might want to be careful on. It's basically a guidebook to how to get from here to there. And where is there? There, at least in this very early period of ancient Egyptian history, are the stars at the very southerly realm of the horizon. If you know a little bit about astronomy, you'll know that those stars at the very southern edge of the horizon, they never sink. So you would go to live there among the stars that never sank. You would achieve immortality there among the gods. These texts, appropriately called the pyramid texts, Egyptologists don't have a flair for spicing it up. The pyramid texts are among our earliest texts in Egyptian hieroglyphs, so if you want to read them, again, you can find them online. And the pyramid texts are our earliest examples of technology by which a living being, like you and I, could for the first time transition from this reality to that other reality. If you want to read them, you can read them online, and you can see this is how they thought it went down. The pyramid texts are the earliest example of that. Now, what's important about these texts is, as you can imagine, all the guys doing all the work, and all the women doing all the work to get this guy to be immortal, well, guess what they don't want? They don't want to die either. So what do? They begin developing their own version of this technique. What's going to begin to happen is that the afterlife is slowly going to become democratized. First just for kings, then just for royals, then just for priests, and then eventually for everyone. What we see on these, and I'm pretty sure you've seen one of these in person, if you've ever been to the DIA in Detroit, you can go look at one of these. This is a coffin, and again, I don't like using the term coffin here, because coffin insinuates the idea that there is a dead person in here. The person put into this, using all of these incantations, is just a tiny version of the pyramid spells. It's just a very small version of a pyramid with many of the same incantations. In fact, you could pick your incantations. So you would go through a list and be like, I want that one, and I want that one, and I want that one, because that's what you personally wanted to have on there. In fact, if you see here, this is the hieroglyph for the soul. The Egyptians pioneered one of the most important innovations in all of Western spiritual and philosophical history. How many people here believe they have a soul? Yeah, most people here believe they have a soul. Many people do. And if you go on like a first date, don't tell your date you don't have a soul. It sends really weird vibes. But most of us think we have a soul. We think that it's immortal. We think that it is not exactly the same as our body. We think that it's kind of exists with our body, but we often think it maybe existed prior to you, and many people believe that it will exist after you. So, what did the Egyptians believe? They believed that you had several souls. The soul's actually several different things, depending on the text, sometimes up to 6 things. So you had a Ba, right? You had a Ba, that is you. That is your personality. All your memories, all your thoughts, all your consciousness. The thing that is you is your Ba. Your Ka, right, is the part of you that will live forever. Now, what can happen, or what does happen when you transition, is that your Ba is trapped inside your body and it needs to get released. Your Ka is already sort of outside of you. So what is the job? What do these spells do? What do these priests do? After you die, you have to open the mouth. That's the ritual. It's called the opening of the mouth ritual. You let the Ba out, and then you reunite it with the Ka, and it becomes a new thing called an Ach. And I bet you can hear a word in there. Ach. Folks ever seen the little cross, the loop at the top? It means life. This lives forever. You want that to happen. So, now, you might be asking, what happens if that doesn't happen? What happens if your Ba is stuck in your body? Well, just in case, we'll give you as long as possible to get your mouth opened. So what will we do with you, with your physical body, to make sure you have as long as possible to get that done? We will mummify you. Mummify you. So that is where these techniques come from. This becomes very democratized. What you're looking at here is an image of the Papyrus of Anubis. It's one of the most famous Egyptian papyri ever produced. This is from a book called The Book of Coming Forth by Day. Now, you may know it as the Book of the Dead, but again, I'm going to keep beating this horse. They're not dead. It can't be the Book of the Dead. It's exactly the opposite of the Book of the Dead. Because this person, Ani, they're going to live forever. Maybe. What do you have to do to live forever? One, you need one of these guidebooks, The Book of Coming Forth by Day. A new one, that's not exactly the right word. A 3,000-year-old, 55-meter one was just discovered this year in Saqqara. You can see pictures of it online. It is magnificent. If you want to see one, you can go to the Detroit Institute of Art. They have one there. If you're going on a journey before you have, I don't know, your phone, you would have an atlas. You may even have like a book to tell you where to go eat and how to get there and what part of town to avoid. This is that for people in the transition. The book of Coming Forth by Day was the guidebook that you would take with you when you transitioned. Now, there are a lot of perils in this whole process, and the most important one I'm going to describe to you now is this one. What's happening in this scene is that the person that is going to the afterlife, hopefully, they're having their heart weighed by this guy named Anubis, the god of the dead, and he's weighing their heart, which is where imagine your heart is kind of like a part of you that's like a rag. When you commit sins, the rag gets dirty. You purify the rag by doing good deeds and asking for forgiveness. That should all sound pretty familiar. The Egyptians believed that too. But what happens if you die and the rag's still dirty? Well, in this text, there are what are called false confessions, which are not false in the sense of not true, but you say, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, and you try to purify your soul, your heart, by the very end. So, what happens? Your heart is weighed against the feather of justice, ma'at. Now, I would not want my heart weighed against a feather, because if your heart has even a little sin, then the feather of justice, ma'at, that's my boy Toth there recording all of this down. So he's like the court recorder. I'm it. This demon, part crocodile, part tiger, part hippo, because the Egyptians had a flair for that kind of thing. If your heart weighed more than the feather of Ma'at, Amit ate your soul. And that was the end. You didn't go to hell. You just didn't go anywhere. Full stop. So for them, for the Egyptians, there was no hell, there was just annihilation. So, before you go to bed tonight, make sure your heart's right, because you don't want this to happen to you. I always imagine like evangelical Egyptians, like, does your geb weigh more than the feather of Ma'at? I can imagine the billboards in ancient Egypt. This is the things that go through my mind. At any rate, you can get good translations of this online as well if you want to read the whole thing. It's quite nice. So, the Israelites. I'm sure some folks have heard of them. I'm told that I am one of those people. The Israelites, they are a peculiar people. They remain a peculiar people. Very peculiar, my in-law. They've gotten on this weird bug called monolatry. Now, monolatry is an interesting word. Monolatry means they worship one God. Now, it doesn't mean they only believe in one God. That will come later, but at least early on, they were worshiping one God, this God named Yahweh, whose name seems to be something like the one that is, or the one that causes to be. We don't really know where this God came from, and we don't really know how it developed. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but we can come to that later. They also had a very weird thing about their God, is their God couldn't be seen. Now, every other god in the world, at least in their world, was a god that could be seen. In fact, you went to special places to see the gods. They were called temples. Romans, for instance, would go to the Israelite temple and be like, where's your God, bro? Like, he's invisible. Like, he's invisible. like your friends when you were little invisible? Like, people often still find this idea a bit perplexing. But even more perplexing than that is the Israelites began to develop a tension in their theology. And the tension goes something like this. My God, our God, is bigger and more powerful than all your gods. Now, to make their God bigger and more powerful, they're all like, every theologian, that's all middle school stuff. My God beat up your God. So the idea is that if my God is bigger and better than your God, my God must be more distant than your God. My God is more powerful, he's older, he's more ancient. My God is further away than your gods, beyond anything you can imagine. And yet, another part of Israelite theology, they made a deal with this God. They had this little thing called the Torah, where they made a deal with this God, and the deal goes, if you believe in me and just worship me, I'll give you stuff. Land, children, and agricultural success. Right? I'll give you stuff. It's a vassal contract. Not only that, the story is, this God showed up to a bunch of people, and some dude climbed on a mountain and got some rules. A lot of rules. Let me tell you, a lot of rules. So we have a problem. This God somehow shows up once, right? And it's like, here's a bunch of rules, do this. And yet the theologians are like, no, God's beyond everything. Have folks ever struggled with this tension? How can God be beyond everything and yet be so radically immanent? This is a perplexing problem. And theology and mysticism are going to wrestle with this in a big way. We'll talk a lot about it next time, to be sure. So there's lots of solutions for this problem, and one of the solutions is going to be a little thing called mysticism, which we're going to talk about at length next Thursday. So if you're interested in mystics and mysticism, if you are a mystic, we're going to really talk about that as a technology by which people try to solve this problem. By the way, this shrine that you're looking at here in this picture, this is the Tel Arad shrine. This was recovered near Jerusalem. It was destroyed by an Israelite king named Josiah, a Judean king, actually. He destroyed all of the non-Yahweh shrines, and he destroyed all the Yahweh shrines that weren't the temple one in Jerusalem. This one was preserved because he destroyed it. He tore it down and basically buried it. It's great for archaeologists when you go on rampages like that. At any rate, you see this, see that little shrine right there? They scraped the top of this because we know in Yahweh shrines they burned incense because God likes things to smell good for whatever reason. The smell of like barbecue seems to be a thing God likes. I mean, you've read the Old Testament, right? It's like burn animals. I like the way that smells. I mean, literally, it's a pleasing aroma to the Lord. It really says that. I lived in Memphis for a while, and I'd walk past the barbecue places, and I'm like, I get it. They scraped the top of this just a few years ago because they knew that they burned incense on it. Hey, guess what turned up in these? Yeah, cannabis. Cannabinoids. Now, do you know this was a very small room? This was all enclosed at some point. You can imagine this was an enclosed room and they're burning cannabis on an altar. They were like hotboxing for the Lord. There's no other way to describe it. Again, we love to imagine religion back in the day as somehow being different than now. But people got to God all kinds. The stairway to heaven, there's a lot of ways up that road. And getting high as a Georgia pine is one of them. I'm not making this stuff up. And there's people now who are like, of course that's not real. And they're like, I mean, it's archaeology, man. They're not making it up. But you can visit the shrine, by the way, if you go to Israel. In the Israel Museum, the shrine is preserved in the museum along with the cannabis. Going over to our friends in Greece. Greece is really going to solve or present to us a really interesting dichotomy of solutions for this problem. How do we contact that other world? And they're going to give us two of the perhaps strangest answers. One of those are going to be the mysteries. The mysteries are secret religious cults, and we use the word cult here loosely. They're just secret religious groups that you got initiated into, and then you did some secret stuff, and then you went to the other world temporarily, and then you came back. They're called the mysteries because the word muon means to remain quiet. So once you were initiated into the mysteries, you weren't allowed to talk about what happened in them. And if you talked about what happened in them, you could be put to death. So this was a big deal. In fact, there's a famous case of a famous Athenian general, dude named Alcibiades. You may know him as the lover of Socrates and a really heroic drinker. He got real drunk one night and told the mysteries in public. And he got in a fair bit of trouble, nearly executed for this. So the mysteries, and these are the Eleusinian mysteries and Dionysian mysteries, there are lots of different mysteries. We think maybe these involve psychedelic drugs. We don't know because we don't call them mysteries for a reason. Like, there's a reason why they're called that, but we think that they were involved psychedelic drugs. Maybe ergot. Ergot grows as a fungus on rye and is a precursor to LSD. So we think that maybe it was wine soaked in ergot and that was what you got. Because we know that people drank wine and they all of a sudden they were not here anymore. So, sounds, yeah. If it isn't LSD, it'll do until the LSD shows up. So what we have is this mystery cults that allow people to go into these other worlds. Now, all kinds of people that you would normally think of as rational, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they were all initiated into these mystery cults. They thought it was incredibly important to be initiated into them. So again, we think of them as the founders of Western philosophy and rationalism, but they thought the way you get to the gods is by drinking some magic Kool-Aid and go to the other world. So that was one part of it. The other part of it, I should mention this text here. You're looking at the earliest recovered book in Europe, or the fragment of it. A guy who died, he was burned on a funeral pyre, and sometimes the gods smile upon us people. They put a book of one of these mystery cults on top of his funeral pyre, and it only halfway burned. We don't know why. And it only halfway burned, and the part of it that didn't burn was so dried out that when they buried him, it survived in his tomb, and we recovered it when they knocked into it building a road in Thessaloniki. We now have what is called the Derveni Papyrus, the oldest papyrus, the oldest book recovered in Europe, and we have this weird text. What it is, by the way, is a hymn written by Orpheus and a philosophical commentary describing how it's true both mythologically, but it's also true philosophically. It is fascinating as a text. And it totally flies under the radar. Most people have never heard of it, even though it's like the oldest book recovered in Europe. That's kind of a big deal. At any rate, on the other side of things, people were trying to figure this out by what is called logos, through intuition, through reason. Maybe we could get to the other world by logic. Now, I know that sounds unlikely to many of you, but you have to understand that logic is pretty weird. Mathematics is pretty weird. Have you ever taken a physics class and thought to yourself, why is the world describable this way? Why is it that the math never seems to be wrong? Well, it might just be because that's all there is. The math might be real. Einstein famously said, the language of God is mathematics. So when I say logic, and you think, how can you get to the gods by logic? How else could you get to them? Think about pi for a second. I'll give you an example of this. Pi is an irrational number, non-repeating, right? And it never ends. For every value of pi, there is a digit, right? Between 1 and 9. That means that there is an infinite length of digits. And we know that for every place, there is a true digit. Did we invent pi, or did we discover it? Because if it's eternal, if it's infinite, and we know that there's a true value for every single character, that means it must have been there before us, weird apes thinking. That meant the math was always there, hiding, waiting for us to find it. The Greeks took that very seriously. The dude named Pythagoras, he's kind of big on triangles. He traveled to Egypt to learn about triangles because, they had that figured out over there. He would come back with a hugely important invention. That hugely important invention would be the soul. Pythagoras got the concept of the soul from the Egyptians, and he would bequeath it to a dude named Plato, right? And that's going to change the world. You probably believe in the soul more because of Plato than because of Israelite religion. There's no real concept of the soul in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Ecclesiastes even says, who knows if the soul of an animal goes into the ground, the soul of a human being goes somewhere else? Who knows? The Hebrew Bible is completely agnostic about souls. It's only in the New Testament where it becomes an idea. That's because the New Testament is very heavily infused with Greek philosophy, things like Plato. So if you believe in the soul, you can thank Plato, then thank Pythagoras, and then thank the Egyptians. It comes from them. At any rate, what we have is going to be a huge debate in the world of Greek philosophy, a debate we've never ended. One dude named Heraclitus, it's an ornery dude, he argued pantare, everything flows. Everything is constantly changing, right? Everything is constantly in flux. And his opponent, a guy named Parmenides, said, the one is all. Change is an illusion. There's just the one. There's just being. In being is that which is. And that which is, at every moment, is never changing. Imagine an old school film strip. At every given moment, the film strip is still. But when you spin it, it looks like it's moving. You're living in the illusion of movement. Parmenides would say, all this movement is an illusion. Heraclitus would say, no, stability is the illusion. And they argued and argued and argued until a dude came along named Plato. And he said, the answer is simple. Because, that's what philosophers do. Take real complicated things and go, it's easy. Plato's answer is you. You are the answer to this problem. Because you're made of two things. You're made of a body, and that body is in the world of becoming. It's constantly changing. I think it's every 7 years. You change all the cells in your body. I don't know if that's true or not. Sometimes I want to wake up next to my wife and be like, what the hell are you? It's been 7 years. You tell my student loan people that. I don't know who that dude was that took them loans out. Wasn't me. You are constantly changing. You're constantly in flux. You are in the world of becoming. But you also have another part of you. That Egyptian part of you. You have a soul, and the soul doesn't change. It'll never die, and it will go on past the body. It'll go on past this world. The human dyad is for Plato the solution to this problem. You are the nexus between the world of being, the world of immortal eternality, and the world of physical matter constantly in flux. You are that thing at the very center of that entire drama. And Plato says, if you just focus on the soul part and really get turned on to that, death is nothing to you. In fact, when Socrates died, you may know this, right before he died, he took poison. He was forced to take poison by bad people. But right before he took the poison, right before he died, he famously told his student, hey, go to the temple of Asclepius and give a sacrifice on my behalf. A strange thing to ask. Do anyone know what the god Asclepius was the god of? Probably still have him on your insurance card. He's the god of healing. Asclepius is the god of healing. Socrates, the moment he was dying, said, go make a sacrifice on my behalf to the god Asclepius. You only did that if you were being healed of something. Socrates was being healed of his body. I've even been, my wife's a rabbi. Thank you for your condolences. My wife's a rabbi. One of the things we have to deal with often is people passing through this world. And many times people say things like, this body's just a cage now. I can't wait to be free of it. It's a clay prison. Those ideas are deeply, deeply infused by Platonism. The idea that your soul will somehow escape and survive this. Just a few more slides. Everybody began at this point to tinker with how to get out of this world. Because, as you can imagine, this kind of world, I don't know, if you watch the news, it's kind of right? And it was a lot more back then. And so there were all kinds of techniques, technologies, about how to get out of this world. I'll just give you a couple of these. Remember I told you how God used to ride on this cool chariot throne? There's God's chariot throne. This coin was minted by the Persian Empire for the province of Judea. They depicted the Israelite God. That says Yod-He, Vav-He. It says Yahweh. So it's like written on the coin. But that's what the Judeans thought of their God. There he is enthroned on a winged chariot throne. An entire group of mysticism, Jewish mysticism called Merkava mysticism, chariot mysticism, was a technique by which righteous Jews could travel to the divine realm and witness the throne of God. It often killed them, or made them crazy, or made them apostates. This was not a safe thing to do. But Merkava mysticism, we have a dozen texts to survive from the ancient world about techniques that Jews used to transverse into the world of the divine. There's all kinds of dangerous angels and stuff in there. Angels in Judaism, by the way, are not the little fluffy, cute, pudgy babies. They're like celestial marines. They're like the Green Berets of heaven. They're pretty scary, and so you had to find out ways to bypassing them with passwords and secret hand gestures and all kinds of stuff. So this was the literature that developed a way to get to that world. I'll be teaching a class, I think, online about this, maybe later in the summer, fall. For my Christian folks, as you probably know, Jesus and all of his buddies were all Jewish. Paul being one of his buddies. Paul didn't know the guy while he was alive, but he had a vision of him after he died. So that's, you slide into home base sometimes. At any rate, in the book of 2 Corinthians, if you've read your Bible today or recently or ever, in the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul says, I know a guy who was taken up to the third heaven. And then later on in the paragraph, he admits that it was him. But he did this technique. We are fairly confident, scholars are fairly confident, that Paul was one of these mystics experimenting with techniques by which to go into the divine world. By the way, that vision that he has in 2 Corinthians, we also think is the same vision that he had that informed him, Christ informed him to go preach among the Gentiles. So if that vision is the same vision, this technology changed the world. Because the Jesus movement went from being an exclusively Jewish movement to being a Jewish and Gentile movement under the leadership of Paul And that altered the course of history completely. The Jesus movement would have died out, I think, had it not been for the ingeniousness of Paul. And Paul admits to having these kinds of visions. This technology, Merkava, Hechelot just means palaces. I think this technology is very much at the root of Paul's vision and very much changed the world. And no, most folks have never heard of it. But all the cool stuff, this is where you get to be like a cool hipster person. Like, have you heard about Merkava mysticism? Hanging around me, you get good at cocktail parties. Because I just like drop bombs on people. Like, have you ever heard about Paul being a mystic and went to heaven and that changed the world? They're like, what? True story. This literature is so weird that one of the most famous people to engage in one of these journeys was a guy named Enoch. You may know Enoch from early on in the Bible. Enoch is one of the only two characters in the Hebrew Bible not to die. Enoch and Elijah are the only two in the Hebrew Bible not to die. Enoch simply goes with the Lord. We have other literature from this time period where he goes into the world of the heavens, he sits upon the divine throne and is instantly transformed into an angel called Metatron, which sounds like a transformer from my childhood. But he is transformed into Metatron, and often in these literature he's called the Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh. This gets really, really weird, because this is supposed to be monotheism, and you got like little Yahweh, and what is this? This literature is like science fiction Judaism. It's the best. Beats the hell out of the Talmud. That thing's boring. It's like, what happens if your ox falls in a hole or something? Like, I don't know. I want to read about this guy being transformed into an angel. Other journeys are also known. Here in Alexandria, Alexandria is known for its wisdom. You know it for its library, of course. There were groups of people called Gnostics. This term's a little complicated. I'll use it, but know that I'm using it with like scare quotes and all the academic provisos that go along with disclaiming myself, so someone's like wagged their finger at me on the internet. But the Gnostics believed that this world, right, they took Platonism to the extreme. Not only will your soul survive into the next world, but this world is bad. It's bad. I mean, how many times have you been like running or working out or doing something and or you're sick and you're just like, your body just isn't doing what you want it to do? You're like, just don't be sick. Just lift heavier. Like, why are you so weak? Your brain, I mean, how many people here think of themselves as sort of like a body of like a meat machine, and you're like a soul inside piloting it, and your soul's like driving it, but you're like, The Gnostics thought that's the way it was, but this is all evil. In fact, it not only is evil, the God that made this world is himself evil. Called Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos. This world is all evil. But Jesus comes from a different world, and he came to this world to tell us the truth about this world, that it's fake, and here's how you escape it. Then they disagree about how to escape it. That's how they become all the different groups. It's job security. It's like, that's not how you do it. This is how you do it. At any rate, one of these Gnostic groups left us a book, many books, this one's called the Book of You, not you as in you, but you as in I-E-O-U, the true God. And they give you maps of what the world looked like, the upper worlds, the true worlds. These are camps full of divine beings that you have to bypass using all kinds of magical words that you can clearly read in front of you. This is in the Coptic language, the last form of Egyptian language. But you have the names of these beings, you have how to bypass them, and you even have magical symbols by which you can use against them to like, leave me alone, this guy. So this is an intact book that survives from antiquity, and it is basically a way of how to get out of here and how to journey up through the stars to leave this realm. Another sect that existed was a group called the Hermeticists. They followed a quasi-divine being called the thrice great Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus. And they had their own literature about how to purify your soul through reverence and how you could cleanse your soul of all kinds of demons that had infected your soul. And they were like weights. And as you cleaned the demons out of your soul got lighter and lighter and lighter until eventually you just yeeted out into the world of the stars. And you could even get glimpses in this life of the world beyond. Some of that literature survives too. In fact, it was translated for the first time into the vernacular in the 15th century by Marsilio Ficino, and it transformed the Renaissance because it gave people a theory of how to get out of this world that wasn't Catholicism. And that's the occult. The occult grows out of that. Like, here's an alternative religion that is older than Christianity. So Your mileage may vary. But this text, next week if you come, I'll bring some of this literature and I'll lay it out and you can take a look through it and figure out your own path out of this world. Among the pagan philosophers, like Plotinus, he held that one could only escape this world by turning inward to what is really you, your soul. It's what he called the flight of the alone to the alone. It's a beautiful language. But he says, by turning to what is truly you, your soul, and focusing on your soul, looking inward, right? Language that we use now, right? The idea of your true self, your inner self. That language was developed primarily by Plotinus. And he said, by intellectually contemplating your true self, you can purify yourself and thus escape out of this world to the world of the divine. His grand student, Iamblichus, said, you got to have religion because the gods have to help you. The gods have to aid you through grace. You have to have faith in them. You have to do sacrifices. They have to help you climb up, just as in the same way they reach down as you reach up. So there we pioneer the idea that sacrifices and other kinds of sacraments are going to be important. Hold on to that word, sacrament, because it's going to change the world in just a minute. Jewish literature at the same time is also describing all kinds of people going into these other realms to access the world of the divine. Some of these are preserved in the Talmud and eventually become the foundation for what we know as the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. So these texts have a continuous history all the way up until the present day, all the way up to our own native girl from Bay City, Michigan, Madonna. So, hey, you don't know she's not been in the divine world. I want to go that she has. So, she's a material girl, but yeah, but then she got super all about Kabbalah, so maybe she's like the spiritual girl now. I don't know. Who knows? Madonna's too complex for me to plumb the depths of Madonna. I'd rather deal with Plotinus. Christianity is going to square the circle, folks. Christianity, right? And again, I'm not a Christian person, but you got to call spade a spade. You got to recognize genius when you recognize it. Christianity's great genius was combining two things together, two incredibly important concepts together, right? Really three, but let's do three. The first is changing Jesus' messianic mission from a political mission to a spiritual one. Every other theory of the Messiah up at that point viewed Messiah as a political thing. They will overthrow the Romans, make world peace, done. Paul said, no. Messiah is a spiritual thing. It's here to save our soul. Innovation number two, they imported a new idea from the Greeks, the soul. And the idea was Adam and Eve had fallen, their soul had become corrupt, all of our souls are corrupt, and we have to fix it. How do we fix it? JC. JC fixes it, right? Through his sacrifice on the cross. You can call him JC when you know him, he's a good guy. Josh, he goes by. Second thing, the soul becomes imported into Christianity and it becomes the task of the Messiah to redeem it. Third thing, remember that guy Iamblichus? He said that you had to have sacraments to mediate the process. The Catholic Church picked up on that in a big way. And what do they argue? You can't do it yourself. How do you have to do it? Through the mediation of the church and through the application of the sacraments. And there all of the sacraments are, from birth to baptism to marriage to visiting the sick all the way to final orders. The church is going to combine all of this into one grand package. And at the end of the day, if you do all of this because of what he did on that cross, which they call it Good Friday, but every time I see pictures of Good Friday, it doesn't look so good for the guy on the cross. It's good for these people. But by doing this, by him doing that, all of these people get to go to the world where he lives forever. Christianity takes what is effectively the entire basket of technologies from the ancient Egyptians to the pagan Greeks to all these different people. They combine them into one theological narrative. But they still have one problem. The problem goes like this. God seems really far away, and we seem really far down here. What happens to people who bridge the gap without the sacraments? What about people who can achieve that union through mystikos, through mysticism? What do we do with those people? And further, Second problem we'll deal with next week. What happens when God is real far away and you're way down here? Seems like a lot of wasted space. So what do? You fill it. And what do you fill it with? All kinds of stuff. Oops, I don't have that slide. But I'll bring it out next week. But you fill it with all kinds of stuff. And the things you fill it with are angels and demons and all manner of things. So you fill the gap. So what we'll talk about next week are two major topics. One, how they filled the gap. Right? And where this all with how the gap was filled earlier. And two, what about all the people that seem to be able to cross the bridge, to build the bridge on their own without the church? What do we do with those people? So I hope you'll join me next week as we talk about the bridges that human beings, at least in the Western world, have built to the divine. And if you want to be in touch with me, you can find me here on my YouTube channel, which I focus on this material in my YouTube channel. But also you can contact me on my website. And I hope that I can see you next Thursday as we continue to go down the path of how human beings, from the very beginning of our history to the very modern day, have built bridges to a world well beyond this one. Thank you.